The enemies of the gospel, let's say, they understand better than Christians do the power of words. And they understand that they're the basic building blocks of culture. They want to change the culture. They're cultural revolutionaries.
Yes.
And they recognize, they know to their credit that they've got to change language in order to change culture. Christians used to understand that.
Right.
So when we understood that, in previous centuries, we still translate the Bible, but we didn't just translate the Bible into indigenous languages. We taught people to read so they could access it directly.
Yes.
And we brought those words into the culture by establishing schools, universities, and they became institutionalized because we recognized the power of words. That's been flipped. Now it's the enemies of the gospel that understand that. Christians have largely forgotten that.
Every culture war boils down to a skirmish over words, those seemingly insignificant things that can either construct cathedrals or blow them to smithereens. Neutral ground, you ask? Not in the least. The battle for the dictionary is no mere semantic quibble. It's the grand theater where truth duels with falsehood, where Christianity locks horns with its eternal nemesis, rival religions and half-baked philosophies. Words, you see, are not harmless playthings, nor are they casual scribbles on a page. The Greeks knew it, calling it logos, a term far too majestic to be left to casual Instagram captions. To speak a word is to animate an idea, to breathe life into it like a potter shaping clay, or if poorly wielded, to fumble your way into an intellectual train wreck. And here's the kicker. There are no neutral ideas. Each one tips its hat to either God or the golden calves of modernity. Every utterance, no matter how casual, is an act of worship, be it to the Creator or to the vain, petty idols du jour. Look around you. Today's wordsmiths are hard at work, reshaping language with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. Gender becomes the Swiss Army knife of biological revisionism. Homosexuality conveniently sanitizes sodomy. Abortion cloaks infanticide in palatable euphemism. Social welfare turns state-sponsored theft into a virtue. Equality is little more than envy dressed up for Sunday brunch. And then there's humanism, which arrogantly fancies itself the heir to the image of God. Joining me today is Scott Allen, a man who knows all too well the battlefield of words and their consequences. An author, teacher, and cultural commentator, Scott has dedicated his life to unpacking the profound implications of biblical worldview in a world gone mad. His best-selling book, Why Social Justice is Not Biblical Justice, an urgent appeal to fellow Christians in a time of social crisis, has stirred more pots than a kitchen full of chefs. His latest offering, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, Restoring the Meaning of Our Most Important Words, could not be timelier. Scott serves as the president of the Disciple Nations Alliance, an international ministry equipping Christian leaders to live out a biblical worldview. With nearly 2 decades of experience at Food for the Hungry and countless miles traveled across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Scott has seen firsthand how the gospel transforms lives and how twisted ideas can devastate them. He resides in Bend, Oregon with his wife, Kimberly, and they have 5 children and are in the business of spoiling 3 grandchildren. Scott Allen, welcome to Of Flames and Crowns.
It's just so good to be with you.
Before this week, I kind of spoke about how I had the opportunity to be on your podcast a couple of times. So I really appreciate you taking the time and coming to join me for this incredible conversation.
It's a total honor, Lennox.
Yeah.
By the way, that was really impressive, what you just said there. I was thinking I could never say it that well. It was amazing.
Well, there's a certain book called 10 Words to Heal a Broken World that helped a little bit with this. So thank you for that. Yeah. Speaking of words, Scott, what is it that really prompted you to consider writing your latest book on words? Why that subject?
Yeah, there's a long story behind that, and maybe I could tell it briefly. I suppose it began when I was a senior in college, university. I went to Willamette University in Oregon, Salem, and felt a call to. I was a young Christian, felt a call to mission. Went to Urbana, this big missions conference.
Okay.
That was 1987, and the last night, the speaker from the platform asked the many thousands of students that were gathered there, if you feel God calling you to a life dedicated to the mission of the church, the missions, stand up. And I just stood up, didn't really know what I was doing. So, but I just felt so compelled, that God was calling me in this way. And so, yeah, that's a calling that's been on my heart, ever since. I served overseas as a cross-cultural missionary right out of college. And but over time, I began to see, this is the surprising part, I guess I would say. In my mind, missions at that time was sharing the gospel, across cultures and planting churches, and that is, part of the mission. But I began to see that the mission was actually much broader than that. That was kind of a starting point. And the clearest way that I describe the mission of the church, it goes back to Genesis 12 and the call to Abraham, where God says to Abram, come out of the land and go to the land I'll show you, and I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to bless you. And then he says, and you will be a blessing. And at the end of time, at the end of history, all the nations on earth will be blessed through you. Yeah. And that's the great unchanging plan of God through time, is to bless the nations. That's a broader concept than just getting people saved and getting them into churches.
Yes.
You see, and so that became the compelling thing for me. And then I saw the problem. I saw, well, the church has kind of lost sight of that bigger mission. It's got this narrower idea.
Yes.
So I've really then dedicated my life in some ways to helping the church. This is the part I didn't get when I stood up. I thought, I'll be a cross-cultural missionary and church planner.
Right.
But here I am now writing about words.
Yeah.
And it's because, I want the church. I have a passion to see the church recapture this bigger understanding. And if you want to see nations blessed, they have to be grounded and rooted in the Word of God.
Yeah.
And not just in the Word of God, but this is the thing, the words of God.
Yes.
Words like freedom and justice and future. And there's so many words that we use every day in our language that we wouldn't even have in the English language if it wasn't for the Bible. They came into the English language through the Bible. In other words, they didn't exist in the indigenous language.
Yes.
The Bible translators brought the ideas, those opened up new spaces in the mind, and they here's the kicker, they changed the culture.
Yes, they did, didn't they?
Yeah, so I could go on and on, but that's a long kind of a description of what led me to write this book.
Yes.
I've always had a passion for the power of words to bless nations.
Right.
So, yeah.
In my opening monologue, I made reference to the fact that we're in a war for words, a war for the dictionary, essentially.
Yeah.
How have you seen that play out? How would you describe what this war is? What does it look like? Where are the real points of tension in this war for the dictionary?
Yeah, well, it's a huge war right now. It's massive, and I feel like only one side is really cognizantly kind of engaged in it. So the enemies of the gospel, let's say, they understand better than Christians do the power of words. And they understand that they're the basic building blocks of culture. They want to change the culture. They're cultural revolutionaries.
Yes. And
they recognize, they know to their credit that they've got to change language in order to change culture. Christians used to understand that.
Right.
So when we understood that, in previous centuries, we still translate the Bible, but we didn't just translate the Bible into indigenous languages. We taught people to read so they could access it directly.
Yes.
And we brought those words into the culture by establishing schools, universities, and they became institutionalized because we recognized the power of words. That's been flipped. Now it's the enemies of the gospel that understand that. Christians have largely forgotten that. It's part of the reason I wrote the book. And they've been very busy redefining words. Let me give just one example. This one really opened my eyes at the beginning of this project, the word is, and your listeners and viewers will not be surprised when I go to the word marriage.
Right.
So this is probably about 10 years ago, I actually looked up that word in Microsoft Word, which we use on our laptop, our computers, that has a dictionary embedded in it. And you can hover over a word and you can look up the definition. So I looked up the definition of marriage.
Yes.
This is what I read in that, and I put it in the book here. Marriage is a legally recognized romantic caregiving relationship between consenting adults who intend to live together as sexual and domestic partners. I then went and I looked it up, that word up in Noah Webster's 1828 Dictionary of the American Language, which is America's founding father. And he wrote that dictionary because he knew that a free nation, a free Christian nation, had to be built on the foundation of biblical definitions. So all of his definitions are rooted in the scriptures.
Right.
This is how he defined marriage. This is a paraphrase of it. Marriage is a God-ordained, comprehensive, exclusive, and permanent union that brings a man and a woman together to be husband and wife and father, and to be a father and mother to any children their union brings into being. It's based on the truth that men and women are different and complementary, the biological fact that reproduction depends on a man and a woman, and the social reality that children need a mother and father.
Yes.
I was stunned because I thought, that is such a radical change.
It is.
And it's already been redefined in the sense that it's in this dictionary that's on the laptop that everyone references. When did that happen? Who changed that? How did that process work?
Right.
But it had been changed. And because that definition had been changed, it laid, this is again, if you want to change culture, you change language. It laid the foundation for the change of law. So after that, the Supreme Court with the Obergefell ruling made marriage a same-sex kind of union. And then the change goes from there. So before you can change laws and do these kinds of things, you have to change definitions. So the left understands that the enemies of gospel, they've been doing it. And Christians, this is my real alarm, and kind of in some ways the reason I wrote the book is because I think Christians we've lost sight of this whole thing. And because we're not aware of the tactic or the power of words, even though it's our heritage, it's our very heritage, we actually begin to absorb these false definitions in the culture. And so too many of my fellow Christians, they read a definition of marriage like this and they think that's what it means. So this is alarming.
Yeah.
So
it is. Something I want to go back to here, by back, I mean all the way to the beginning, just talking about the significance of words here. Words created the world.
Yes.
Right? Words, man understood his mandate because certain words were spoken to him. Interesting enough, words were also used to prompt the fall of man. Right?
That's right.
Did God really say?
Yes.
So there's a distortion or an attempt to redefine words in that regard.
Absolutely.
And so I think there you see this precedent for the importance of words. God, that's how God made the world. Right?
Yeah, Satan says in the garden, did God really say?
Did he really say?
He calls into question the words of God.
Yes.
Did God really say?
Yes.
That's the same tactic he uses down through history.
Yes, absolutely. And you see that time and time again.
Right.
So you can really see that there's a potency to words. And in a sense, that's kind of what makes truth as potent as it is.
Yes.
But even lies as destructive as they are.
Yeah.
In some of your work and experience, where have you experienced deceitful words or words that have been misdefined, destroying cultures? You're very well traveled. You've been on several continents.
Yeah.
I'm just interested to know what you've seen in the places you've been.
Sure.
That would demonstrate the power of words and either their ability to build or destroy.
I just want to underscore what you're saying is really important when we talk about the power of words.
Right.
I think this easily becomes kind of an academic and heady discussion that people tune out to. And words are something that we totally take for granted. We just use them. but we don't think about them.
Right.
Like we're using them right now to have this, this conversation. So we've been using them since the time we were tiny children and began speaking. But words are amazing things. And I think you just have to kind of step back and appreciate that for a second. First of all, God himself, right, is a speaking God, as you said. When he created all that exists, he used words. It says God spoke and the universe came into being.
Yes.
The Apostle John, when he describes Jesus in the beginning of the Gospel of John, he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything that came into being came through God. Yeah. So God's a speaking God. He's a person. He uses language. And that the power of that is that he creates everything, physical and spiritual, through the power of his spoken word. Then he makes us, man, in his image. And then we have this incredible capacity, like God does, to use words. Right. And again, that's something we shouldn't take for granted. Animals don't, they function by instinct, but they don't use words and language. We do.
Yes.
It's, and that's because we bear God's image. Yeah. And those words that we use have that same creative potential. Right. No, I shouldn't say the same, right? So we don't create out of nothing like God does. Yes. But as my mentor, Darrell Miller, says, when we use words and language, we still create. We just create culture.
Right, exactly.
We create culture. The cultures that exist around us are created by words and definitions. And true biblical definitions create humane, just, flourishing, beautiful cultures. This is the blessing. Right. Yeah. So, back to your question. Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind in terms of, in my experience with community development, in fact, this comes out of Africa. Right. You're from Africa. Yes. I think it's Kenya. The word for woman, and this is true not just in Africa, in many cultures around the world. Yeah. As Christians, we understand woman to be a human being, a female human being. God created them male and female, and endowed them with dignity and purpose and worth because they're image bearers of God. Yes. We understand that to be a woman, right? An image bearer of God, with dignity, worth, value, but a female. That is not the way people around the world understand what a woman is. And the word, at one point, Darrell asked, I think it was some tribe in Kenya, what is a woman and what does that word mean? And he said that it's the exact same word that we use for tool. Tool. Wow. Like a shovel or whatever, Yeah. In other words, a woman is something that you use, for labor, for sexual fulfillment. Right. It's a tool that a man uses. Yeah. That's the idea that was passed down generation to generation. Think about how that's going to impact that culture. How is it going to impact the women in the culture? Right. And then how is it going to shape the culture? Right. People ask, well, why is it that some of these communities are so, stuck in poverty? If you think that women are tools, that's the reason. Yeah, exactly. Right. If you change that one definition and you say, no, a woman isn't a tool, she's actually an image bearer of God with equal dignity as you have as a man, but different. Yes. You have radically changed the culture. Right. Yeah. And again, that's the purpose. Yeah. God spoke the true definitions to bless the nations. Right. So that's one example. I give many. Yeah. But that one was really striking to me because we think, well, everyone understands a woman to be somebody kind of special with dignity. No. Culture after culture around the world do not. Right. Yeah. So, right. That's very profound to me. It's such an important thought, because I think what we should take from that is the importance of developing vocabulary that's anchored in truth as a way of building culture. Right. I think we need a lot more of that in countries that are less developed. It's interesting because I guess over the years, people think they can alleviate some third world problems by money, projects, handouts, right? Exactly. And yet what you're suggesting here is a form of discipleship that is helping people become literate. And a literacy that's anchored in truth. Yes. And it's more than that. It's actually putting ideas in people's heads that they never had before.
Right, exactly. Right.
So one of the words that came into our languages from the Bible is the word freedom. Well, actually, I was that one too, but the word future.
Yeah.
You know, it's surprising to people because we often think in terms of the future.
Right.
What we have to realize is when I say we, I mean people that grew up in the United States or the West. We've been discipled over generations with biblical definitions. So we don't even know where these ideas came from. They came from the Bible. But if you go cross-culturally, again, many countries in the world, indigenous people groups, they have no word in their language for future.
Right.
They understand present and past.
Right.
And the past, ancestors and whatnot, shape the present.
Yeah.
But there's not a concept for future.
Wow.
Now, if you don't have a concept in your brain for that idea of future, it's hard even to imagine it, actually.
Yes.
But if you don't have the space in your brain for that idea of future, you cannot develop.
Exactly.
Because development is something that happens in the future.
Right.
Right?
Absolutely.
So you can give all the money you want. You can have the most impressive projects, and people are still going to be impoverished if they don't have an idea of future. So again, it just changes the way we have to understand just development.
Yeah.
Development is, at the end of the day, it's not about money. It's not about wealth transfers or technology. It's about worldview.
Yes.
And it's about biblical words and that can come into a culture just like they did in Europe during the Reformation and when the Bible was translated. Luther was the one that began translating the Bible into German and then Tyndale and others into English. That's when those cultures began to develop.
Exactly.
I was just in Africa recently, and there was a guy from Ivory Coast, and the question that bothered him is all his life is, why are we so poor? Why are we so poor?
Yeah.
And he was looking at Europe, and he was looking at the United States. Why are you so rich? And he thought, maybe it's because you're smarter or you're better. Think about how debilitating that thought is. And I said to him, I said, no, we are not smarter. We are not better. We've had the advantage of the Bible being translated and then taught and embedded in institutions over centuries.
Right.
That gave rise to the prosperity and the flourishing of Western nations.
Exactly.
And that hasn't happened here yet.
Yeah.
But here, it can. It can. That gave him just such hope. Like, we don't have to be the way we are.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
I've heard that as well. People spout this rhetoric that basically articulates a inferiority complex, if we can call it that.
Right.
On ethnic lines.
Yes.
It's, maybe the color of our skin makes us inferior.
Yep.
Which is quite sad. Yeah. Kind of touching on another thing you mentioned in this book, and you mentioned a moment ago as well, freedom.
Yes.
Something I've observed in much of the third world is people define freedom as a sort of emancipation from colonialism. Emancipation from whiteness is another reference I often hear.
Yeah, right.
And so many African countries, for example, are steeped in communism and still believe themselves to be free because they're no longer under the hand of colonialism. Right. Is that something you've observed as well? I mean, you've been to Africa, you've been to much of the third world.
Yeah.
How is a concept like freedom, how does that affect the way people live when they misdefine it?
Well, I think that word freedom, it's another one of these words that has come into the world through the Bible.
Right.
You don't find it in almost any indigenous language. Freedom is just not, in our fallen world, it's not natural, it's not normal. It comes from God.
Yes.
And it comes to us from the Bible. So let's just take the example of secularism, kind of this Darwinian worldview. There is no God, everything is a matter of evolution, and we're just chance, combinations of matter. If that's your starting point, if that's your worldview starting point, what's the basis for freedom? There isn't. The only law that applies there, Darwin said this, is the survival of the fittest.
Right.
If you've got the power to dominate somebody for your own advantage, you'll do it.
Yes.
Right? There's no basis for treating somebody as a free person. Take animism, which is still common around the world. People aren't free. They're subject to the gods and the spirits, witches, ancestors, They live in fear. There's no freedom there. So freedom is not our natural human condition. And the only countries where it actually began to rise up, free people, are countries that were shaped by the Bible, not surprisingly.
Yes.
And you see freedom in the very beginning, right in Genesis chapter 1. You see it in this, well, first of all, freedom is rooted in God himself, who's free.
Yes.
God's free. Nobody compels him. Nobody forces him. He's not a slave to anyone. He's free. He does what he wills.
Right.
Then he makes us in his image. And part of that image that we have, that human dignity, is freedom. Freedom to make choices, and choices that matter. And God says right at the beginning in the Garden of Eden, puts Adam and Eve in the garden, and the very first words he says is, you are free. You are free. And then he goes on, he says, to eat, from any of the trees of the garden.
Right.
But that's really striking. He says, you are free.
Yes.
But then he says, except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? There's a limit. And this is the biblical concept of freedom.
Right.
And I talk about it here. The redefinition, the counterfeit in our secular culture today is freedom is the ability to do kind of whatever you want, without any limit.
Right.
Except for perhaps, so long as it doesn't harm anyone. But even that is really fallacious because, think about abortion, right?
Exactly.
We've killed millions of children. And what word do we use to justify that? Freedom.
Exactly.
You saw that all over the Democratic National Convention.
Oh, yeah.
They had banners using that word freedom. And yet they're killing, there's no freedom for that unborn child, right? So freedom is the ability to do whatever I want if I have the power to do it.
Right.
That's not the biblical concept.
Right.
The biblical concept is freedom is endowed by God. Nobody can take it away. I can't make you my slave. That's forbidden because God made you free.
Yes.
But freedom exists within limits because we live in God's world, right?
Right.
He created this world like with the law of gravity. So I'm free to jump out of an airplane. I am.
Yeah.
But I'm going to die if I don't have a parachute on.
Right.
So, we have to obey the limits that God set. And there's moral laws. And so we have to obey those moral laws. So freedom, and I know people in the West, because we've been so shaped by secular views of freedom, people struggle with that. What do you mean freedom has limits? That doesn't even go together. But I always kind of use the analogy of a sports game like basketball, right? There's limits, there's rules, there's there's boundaries and a framework, and everyone has to agree in advance to play according to those rules.
Right.
Within that sandbox or that framework, there's incredible freedom. You can do all sorts of, you can actually excel.
Right.
So that's the biblical concept of freedom.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Not to do what you want.
Not to do whatever you want.
But to do as you ought.
And if you do whatever you want, here's the irony, it leads to bondage.
Yes.
And that was Satan's temptation way back in the garden.
Exactly.
If you reject God, you will be like God.
Right.
You can do whatever you want like God does. You can be free like God. And then as soon as Adam and Eve fell for that lie, they became slaves. Slaves to Satan, right? And sin.
Exactly.
So you lose your freedom. Or we could even think about it in terms of just drug addiction or whatever addictions that we have when we think we're free to do whatever we want. We quickly realize we become slaves.
Yes, exactly. And I think the boundaries and laws that God gives us, we often like to think of them as inhibiting our capacity for freedom.
Right.
When in fact, they're actually protecting our freedom.
Exactly. Exactly. So well said.
In fact, you kind of see this with the first law that God gave to man, to do not eat of this tree.
Yeah.
Not so much, it wasn't just some arbitrary thing because
right.
God had something against the tree.
Yes.
It was more so, I want you to be free.
Yes.
This is obedience to me is the ground and framework of freedom.
This is how you become free and sustain your freedom.
Exactly.
You only sustain it in obedience to me and my word.
Yes. Yes.
And people today, even secular people, I think of, there's a famous philosopher in England whose name, escapes me, but he says we're undergoing an experiment in the West right now to see whether we can retain our free societies apart from the Bible. And he says the answer is no. We're learning that we can't.
Right.
And he's exactly right. You see it in censorship. We're losing freedom of speech. We're losing all of these freedoms today because we've abandoned the Bible.
Exactly.
Cecil B. DeMille was the director of that famous film, The Ten Commandments, that old film, classic.
Absolutely. Just watched it a few weeks ago, actually.
Yeah, he had some really powerful insights on this. The Ten Commandments was given by God on Sinai right after the Great Emancipation. And even to this day, Jewish people, when they think of their identity as Jews, they go back to the Exodus.
Right.
It's all rooted in freedom.
Right.
We were slaves.
Yes.
God miraculously liberated us and set us free.
Yes.
So there's this deep root of freedom in the Jewish kind of culture and mindset that comes over into Christianity.
Yes.
Then what does God do after he emancipates them? He brings them to the mountain and gives them the law. And Cecil B. DeMille's insight is that God didn't give this restrictive law to constrain their freedom. Yeah. It actually was the law given so that they could sustain their freedom.
Exactly.
That's the biblical concept. Yeah.
Another way I can sort of explain that or illustrate it is if you look at societies that are governed by secularism,
right,
then they tend to have elaborate laws.
Yes.
Laws that you can never really wrap your mind around.
And they grow and they grow and they grow. That's where we're at in the United States.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
When you think about the laws that God gives us, it's generally quite brief.
And it's such a great point. And
it can be summarized in 10 statements.
And even in the New Testament, they even boiled it down further.
Absolutely.
They just kept reducing it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God and love your neighbor.
That's absolutely it.
Then you'll be free.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think such an important concept to understand today.
Especially for Americans, because if there's one thing that God has blessed us with in this country, it's freedom, this gift of freedom. I think it's our legacy. And we can lose it. You can lose it in a generation. So we really have to, this is really a critical time for us on that word freedom.
Yeah, exactly. Especially that I think some people really believe that things like free speech are governed by this concept, this myth of neutrality.
Yes.
Believing that's what safeguards people's interests.
Right. Yeah.
But we need to underscore freedom is anchored in God and God alone.
You will lose it inevitably when you reject God.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another word I want to move on to here is the word sex. A big word.
Yeah. Radically redefined in our contemporary culture.
Redefined in our time.
Right.
Of course, we hear the argument that sex is pretty much arbitrary.
Right.
It doesn't govern how we ought to live.
Right.
It's one of those words that's really assaulted humanity in a lot of ways.
Right.
I'm interested to know if you see a distinction between the words gender and sex.
Yeah.
And whether you think that sort of getting those two words muddled together has prompted some of the confusion that we see today.
Yeah, such a good question. This took me quite a while to kind of sort out in my own mind, because gender has become kind of a weaponized word, right? It's used now in a powerful way to change the culture. What's your gender identity? We have to respect people's, and that understanding of what gender is that LGBTQ plus that just continues to grow with each passing day. So, but let's come back to your question. Biblically, the idea of sex, you see again, all of these definitions really come down from God, and they're kind of unfolded right away in Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. So here we see God creating man, male and female, and then he creates them to govern, and part of that governing purpose is procreation and the raising up of children. So both ideas, biblical ideas of sex, are contained in there.
Yes.
Sex is male and female, that idea. God created, the God created binary there. And then the coming together of those two in the sexual union to produce offspring. So it's really kind of that simple, but it's also really fundamental and really basic. And if you want to destroy a culture, destroy that understanding. You'll destroy one faster than anything. Gender, historically, that's a fine word. Historically, it tended to mean, this is my understanding, it meant how sex, your biological sex as a male or a female, is expressed. So, and that can vary culture to culture. So it's a little bit of a subjective idea. In the West, you express your gender as a male through colors like blue or whatever it is, right? Different cultures. So because there's some subjectivity to it, the people that were redefining sex in our age grabbed hold of that concept, and they said sex is entirely subjective. I think to understand the way sex has been redefined, you really have to go back to have a little discussion on postmodernism too. We live in a postmodern culture.
Right.
And the simplest way I use to explain what that means is that is to think in terms of postmodern time that we live in today, modern that came before it, and pre-modern. Go back to pre-modern. This would have been, the time before the Enlightenment in Europe. And when you think about the authority, who had authority in pre-modern times? Who defined things? It was God. It was the Bible. There was a spiritual realm. Everyone acknowledged that God existed. He was real, and He communicated to us through His Word. That was authority.
Right.
Okay, when we moved into the Enlightenment, and one more thing, God communicated to us truthfully through His creation as well. Okay, when we moved into the modern era, the Enlightenment thinkers essentially abandoned God. You see it in the French Revolution, right? It was a revolution not just politically, but also ecclesiastically, like we're going to get rid of the church. Yeah. We're going to worship the goddess of reason. We're going to abandon this kind of mythology of the Dark Ages, right? So we're going to abandon God and the Bible as a source of authority, but we're going to retain creation, if you will. It's not creation anymore. Now it's nature. So you're still biologically a male or a female, right? That's God doesn't have anything to do with it, but just your basic physical body determines that. Yeah. Okay, now we're into postmodernism. Postmodernism says God doesn't define things, and even biology or nature doesn't define things. Right. I define things. This is postmodernism. I am the center of the universe. Yeah. What defines things is what I believe. It's my mind. That's what creates reality. Now apply that to sex. That's where we're at today. Right. Who are you sexually? Whatever you think you are. That's postmodernism. Yeah. So today, even doctors, when a baby's born, they're not supposed to say it's a male or female now, right? They're supposed to wait until that child's old enough to kind of have a sense of who they are. Yeah. And then they express that, and then if it doesn't align with their biology, it's okay, right, to get the surgeries or to take the hormones, so that they can align, because it's got to be what I subjectively think I am. Yeah. Yeah. This is destroying us, obviously. It's destroying our culture. Yeah. It's literally destroying people's lives. So, anyways, just a little bit on sex. Yeah.
Yeah. Another word that I really want to touch on here today is the word justice.
Okay.
You wrote a book on social justice.
Right.
And sort of outlining some of the damage it's done to the world today.
Right.
And here's the interesting thing, Scott. I think many Christians fell for social justice because on the outset, it looks inviting. Right. In fact, it seems to echo fundamental Christian sentiments there.
Absolutely.
Like the Bible calls us to seek justice.
Yes.
The Bible calls us to care for people, to care for those who are oppressed.
Correct.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I think these little catchwords were very intentionally used to deceive.
Yes.
How have you seen that play out? Of course, you've written on this, so I'm interested to know.
I like to go back to, I always start each chapter with how does the Bible unpack or define this concept of justice before I look at how it's been redefined in the culture. And it's kind of the idea that if you want to spot a counterfeit, you have to know the original. Because often the counterfeit looks like the original. Right. Yeah. And that's really the case with this word justice. There's a lot of kind of overlap, but the differences matter a lot. So let's go back to the original. Justice in its simplest kind of form, I think, is it's just conformity or alignment to a standard for what is good or right or true. It's a standard of morality, a standard for goodness. And that standard, where does that standard come from? It comes from God Himself, from His very nature, right? God Himself, His very character is the standard for what is good. And to violate that standard is to depart from that standard, is to do what is evil, unjust. Okay, so that it's alignment. It's just that simple. So to live in a way that's just is to live in a way that aligns with that standard for goodness that God himself defines.
Yeah.
And interestingly, God himself never violates that standard, right? He always acts in a way that aligns with who he is. He wouldn't actually be God if he didn't. He never lies. He's completely trustworthy and faithful. He's completely and utterly good.
Yes.
And he doesn't change. It's an unchanging standard. Then God communicates the standard to us so that we can operate according to it. He communicates it externally through telling us what it is in the Ten Commandments. And he communicates it to us internally. The Apostle Paul talks about how the law was written on the heart. Even Gentiles who never got the Ten Commandments kind of functioned as if they understood that law because it was written on their heart. And we see that around the world today. So that's the biblically, it's so important to start with that.
Absolutely.
We think of justice too very often with criminal justice, punishment of wrongdoing, not just, the juries and judges do, but, you even do this in the home, right, with your children when they're disobedient, right? So that's a part of justice too. That is the punishment of injustice by God or God-ordained authorities, and that's very important. Not everyone has the authority to punish injustice, to judge or punish. But God-ordained authorities do, and God defines who they are. And that's also just upholding justice, because to uphold justice, you have to correct injustice. You have to punish it, right? God, it demands that. In our fallen world, there's a lot of injustice, right? A lot. And we're guilty of it ourselves very often. This is where the redefiners of justice start. They say, wow, there's a lot of evil in the world. There's a lot of injustice. There are oppressors. There are victims of oppression. That's all true. Okay, where they go wrong, though, well, first of all, they deny God. They start with the division between oppressors and victims without God. So morality is untethered from God. We create the standard for what is right or wrong. So, for example, the way that plays out today is that you see the LGBTQ group being defined as victims. They're the kind of innocent victims. Who are the oppressors? Well, it's Christians who uphold biblical sexual morality. That's oppressive because it keeps them from living out their sexuality in the way that they want. So they're innocent, oppressed victims. Well, that's a violation of the standard for what God says is good. It's an inversion of it. It's taking something evil and calling it good. So they do that, but they start with this is the true thing. There's injustice in the world. Where they go wrong with it, though, is they say the injustice is, they always draw that line between good and evil, between groups. And they say the evil in the world is out there with particular groups. And man has been doing this for a long time. The Nazis did this. The problem with the world is the Jews, right? In Rwanda, it's the Hutus, it's the Tutsis, or whatever it is, right? Today, it's whites, or it's Christian people that uphold Christian sexual morality. Or men. Exactly. That's the source of evil. So it's true, there is oppression, and we should care tenderly for victims, but they have to be defined biblically as well, right? So they've taken this biblical idea and kind of twisted it. And then they've drawn the line in the wrong place. The Bible draws that line between good and evil, not between groups or political parties. It draws it, as Solzhenitsyn famously said, right through every human heart. So the problem with the world, the injustice and the evil, isn't out there, it's in here. And you have to change that. So if you want to root out evil and injustice, you have to go deeper than just let's eliminate whites or let's eliminate Hutus or whatever it is. In fact, that creates greater injustice. So this redefinition of justice is very dangerous, actually. It leads there's a direct line to genocide.
Certainly. Because I guess it's social justice is a revolutionary cause. That's all it's about, seeking to upend whatever perceived power structure exists. And I think what's really sinister about it is, as you kind of echoed a moment ago, there's a sense in which what they do is they reward evil. And they punish these sort of arbitrary categories that God has already called good. And that's unfortunate.
One more thing to add that's really important. What drives them when they talk about justice the end of that isn't moral righteousness. That's what it is for the Christian. It's alignment to God's character. That's just. What drives them is this idea of perfect equality of outcome.
Right. Yeah.
They really are bothered by differences or disparities. And you see this classic Marxism.
Yeah.
When Mao took over China, what's the first thing he did, right? You had to make everyone the same, even to the point of dressing them the same. Everyone had to wear that same outfit. So this idea of sameness is really a powerful driving kind of force behind the redefinition of justice. We want everyone to be the same.
Right.
It's not, equality is also a biblical idea. Yeah. The idea that we are equal. Yeah. God created us in his image with equal dignity. We are equally sinners. God's mercy applies and his love applies equally. He doesn't love some people more than others. Right. And he offers the gift of freedom and forgiveness equally. And then he judges us equally before the law at the end of time, right? He doesn't give, it is a blind justice. So equality is a biblical idea. But they've redefined this word as well. So equality is not equality in that way. It's sameness.
Yeah.
It's tearing everyone down so that they're literally the same.
Exactly.
It's this war on merit. We can't have people, going to Harvard University because they're better, they've studied more. Yeah. We've got to have the same number of blacks, whites, Hispanics, or whatever it is. Yeah. It's this sameness idea.
Yeah. I like to say social justice is unbelief in God's just character.
Yes, well said.
Because that's really what it is. If God is just, then we don't need to employ these methods to enact our own perceived understanding of what justice is.
This word justice, too, I wrote the previous book because the false kind of neo-Marxist or cultural Marxist view of justice has really, we've been really kind of propagandized, through critical race theory and Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement and, you name it. We've just undergone this kind of woke revolution.
Yes.
And that's really come into the church, sadly, so that you have a lot of Christians now. I think of groups that I love and admire and respect, like Campus Crusade for Christ, Crew, right? I mean, from their platform a few years ago, they just were preaching the gospel of social justice. Yeah. InterVarsity, groups I love and respect. So this is really a huge problem. The church has to understand the true definition and defend it. And when we start mimicking the redefinition and kind of baptizing it as a Christian understanding, we're just doing such incredible damage. So
on that point, Scott, I want to talk about silence here for a second, and how damaging silence can be.
Yes.
Adam's silence guaranteed the ruin of the world.
Right. Yeah.
And is that kind of what we're seeing with the church's inability to wield words in a way that can actually shape culture? Yeah. And in their silence and sort of cowardice, choose not to speak the truth and speak words of life. Yeah. What do you make of that thought?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think there's always a temptation to remain silent. And I think we're in a real shift in kind of evangelical culture too in the West. Aaron Wren, who I know you had on this show here previously, he was so helpful when he talked about, we've gone from kind of positive, neutral, negative. Yeah. This is the way that the world perceives Christianity. Yes. And just in my lifetime, we've made the shift. Earlier when I was young, it was good. The culture thought, well, it's very positive. You're a Christian. You're moral, upright, honest. Then it became neutral. Right. Most of my adult life, we were in that kind of neutral world, meaning that the culture looked at Christianity and said, oh, it's okay. Yeah. You can be a Christian if you want. Yeah. That's fine for you. But it wasn't really positive. Now it's negative, right? Now it's downright oppressive.
For me. Yeah, exactly.
In an oppressive kind of cultural climate, the temptation is very strong to bite your tongue, because if you say something, you're going to be, you're going to be despised, you're going to be canceled, you're going to be, and so there's a temptation. We can't speak. And I think in the neutral world, the evangelical church, what it prioritized was we need to have the world think well of us. We need to be winsome. We need to be nice. You know, we and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But where it goes wrong is when that becomes the highest good.
Right, exactly.
It's, you know, everything is based on how the world views us.
Right. Yeah.
Now we're in a negative world. You actually have to get back to something that's much healthier. No matter what you say, the world's going to think negatively of you. So just put aside what the world thinks of you. You should have done that already.
Right, yeah.
Now the priority is just to speak the truth.
Yes.
Now do it lovingly, out of a real desire that people would be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth and escape the snare of the devil. So do it lovingly, but definitely speak the truth and just let go of this idea that it matters what the world thinks.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard. It's hard because you can lose a job. I mean, there's real price to be paid. You can be censored. I heard a podcast just this week. Couple of big name podcasters, I can't remember their names right now, but they were saying it's really important for us because we have this platform to speak loudly and clearly and truthfully because a lot of people can't, meaning that they literally will pay a heavy price that we won't pay. And I thought that was really wise. I think if you have the capacity to speak clearly and boldly and truthfully, you need to do it. Because there's a big price to be paid today for telling the truth. Yeah.
Do you think the part of the reason Christians haven't done this is because we don't have categories outside of salvation and the church in terms of how the world should run?
Totally. It's one of the worst things that's happened to the evangelical church is that it's created this separation, right? It's divided God's world, that he's the Lord of all of it, you know, and it's divided into these categories of kind of more important and less important. And what's more important in this worldview, if you will, is the Bible and church life, you know. These things are important, evangelism, these kind of spiritual things, right? Discipleship, holiness, etc. What's less important is what's called secular stuff. That would be everything else.
Right.
Politics, you know, government, entertainment, leisure, sports, justice, you name it. And the idea there is God is kind of, that's part of the fallen world. That's the secular world. God isn't interested in that. You should prioritize getting people kind of saved out of that into the church, right? And you know, apply it vocationally. What jobs are important? Spiritual jobs, full-time Christian ministry, being a pastor, being a missionary. What's not important? Being a trash collector, a mechanic. Those things, it's important because you need to provide for your family, but it has no eternal value, let's say. This is a horrible message, but this is the message that the church has bought into. When it does, it is no longer discipling the nation. It's not even engaged in the nation because the view is, it's all going to hell. It's all going to be destroyed.
Exactly.
We just got to, it's the lifeboat idea. We just got to rescue people out of it. This historically is not the way the church understood its mission. You know, it understood its mission was God wants to redeem all things. That redemption starts in us. It starts in our hearts, changes our minds. But then we're called into the service of being agents of redemption into this world that God wants to bless. And that means all of it. And so we have to get back to that, and I really hope we do at this time. I think there's some positive signs that things are changing. So
agreed.
Yeah,
and I think what I find very disappointing or unfortunate about it is the way the Bible sort of truncated to just 4 books. And even then, just a few passages in those 4 books. Something I think that should be understood is God in his sovereignty has spoken words over absolutely everything.
Absolutely.
You know, and his domain goes as far as his word spoke. And since he's the one who spoke the cosmos into existence, it all belongs to him. And I think we've really missed that. And there's actually a sense in which we actually reveal our own unbelief in God's word when we think his domain is confined to the seemingly sacred areas of life.
Absolutely.
You know?
No, I wrote this book with that understanding in mind because it's actually, when you think, I want to, all of us, at some level, we want to change the world, right? I want to be a part of changing the world. And we think that's something really big. Like it's something that really powerful people do. And But I want to kind of remind people that it's actually very simple. It's understanding these words, these powerful words that God has given us. And I highlight 10 of them in this book.
Yes.
It's understanding them. It's building our lives on them. Because when you live them out, you become this kind of a city on a hill that the watching world says something's different about those people.
Yes.
Something's good. I want that.
Right.
That's how we change the world, by the way. It's not through force or power or coercion or censorship. We don't use those tactics.
Right.
It's very compelling. I want that. So we live them out. We have to live them out. To live them out, we have to know them. Then we defend them. It's not about, in the first instance, changing laws or, having some kind of social revolution or anything like that. It's in the first instance just as simple as words.
Right.
Knowing them, living them out, defending them. That's how things change. That's how you change the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. A question here, Scott. What role does eloquence have in this discussion? There's a sense in which this has to go beyond merely knowing the right kind of words and having the right kind of definitions.
Yeah.
And I think people can be very lazy about learning to speak with greater clarity or learning to write with more clarity. What role does eloquence have in wielding the kinds of words that shape great cultures?
I'm laughing because you're so eloquent and I'm not. So you've
Not in the
mastered
least.
that.
You do very well.
I think it's really important, and words have incredible power. So whether you're speaking or you're writing, I think of Tolkien. I love that book, Lord of the Rings, as you do.
Yes.
And part of the reason I love it is the story itself.
Right.
But part of the reason I love it is that he just really was excellent at his craft.
Yeah.
He paid attention to every word.
Exactly.
How did it sound?
Exactly.
How did it sound in that sentence? And I think he read every sentence.
Right.
Is there a rhythm to it? Is there, so that it's fun to read? It's so, you just, as soon as you're done, you want to go back and read that again. There's something that's so compelling about it. So, I think we have to hone that. It's a God-given gift and ability, not just to know the words, but to use them very well, powerfully and in a winsome way. Like you, you're my example here on that. So.
Well, I try, but you do pretty well yourself.
Yeah.
Do you have any pointers to people who might be asking how they can develop that skill set? They might be listening to this and thinking, well, I believe this. Words are so important. Yeah. And yet my mouth fails me.
I've thought about this most in terms of writing, just because I've written, and I don't consider myself, a great writer at all, But one of the things I've learned as I began to write, I write because I feel like I'm just kind of compelled to say something. I've got something I want to say. Right. So I've got to write, But not because, I love writing or I'm some kind of gifted writer. But somebody once said to me that, in a sense, it's a skill. And the way you get better at writing is just by writing. And you just have to kind of grind it out, actually, little by little, day by day. There's no shortcuts. Yeah. You just have to practice. It's a little bit like basketball. If you want to be a good basketball player, you've got to dribble and dribble and dribble and dribble until you can't hardly think about it. Yeah. Pass. You have to, same with words. You just have to use them, hone those basic skills. Yeah. So,
absolutely.
I don't think there's any shortcut to it. So.
Yeah. I suppose in this whole conversation, Scott, you've written a whole book on this. What's the one thing you want people to understand about words?
Just their incredible power, the fact that they're little packages for the mind that unlock new ideas. And when those ideas in our brains are unlocked, it opens the door for us to live in different ways. It's just the power of words. It's not just a way of communicating with each other. Right. It's a way of living in a whole new way. The second thing is just the power of biblical words, because God himself defines them. He speaks these words into being through his word. There's such power in these words. as you go deeper into the words, and I had the privilege of doing this as I was writing the book, you just draw closer to God. So my faith in God grew significantly just in the process of defining more carefully what love is.
Right.
Because God is love. God is free.
Right.
God is just.
Yes.
So just go deeper, follow the path of where these words lead. And by the way, you'll never get to the end of that path.
Right.
Because there's no end to God.
Exactly.
But go deeper, further up, further in, as C.S. Lewis said.
Absolutely.
And it's just an amazing journey. I want everyone to take it.
Absolutely. Scott, this has been terrific. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your wisdom so generously. I hope at some point we can do this again.
Love to.
I've thoroughly enjoyed this. So thank you so much, Scott.
My pleasure.